We now move on to the next motion. I call Ben Bradley to move it.
I beg to move this House has considered nurture and alternative provision in primary schools. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, Sir Christopher. I'm grateful to have the opportunity to debate this issue today. I'm also grateful to colleagues that have come along to this debate in what is a standard Brexit day in the House. Education is often a nice light relief for us all. I got into politics to talk about education, somebody who had always wanted to be a teacher before I accidentally found myself here. I have the privilege of working on the Education Select Committee, and in this place they have undertaken, before my time, interesting inquiries on both alternative provision and on the benefit of early intervention for the life chances of young people. It's important that we get the foundations of our education system right, and in my view I think education should always be our key priority. Without it, nothing else works, and without the right support early on in children's lives, the challenges and the costs only grow over time. This debate covers two specific areas: nurture care specifically, and I'm grateful to Nurture UK for the information that they have shared with me, and then alternative provision, each of which I will address in turn. Nurture care begins at home. It's a crucial aspect of the early years of schooling, especially in deprived areas and for troubled families. Across my constituency of Mansfield and Warsop, there's a relatively high level of family breakdown, of mental health issues, of deprivation, in many ways a perfect storm of challenges for both parents and children. This has an impact on educational attainment. In Mansfield, 27% of children start primary school without the core abilities they need to succeed, including speech and language skills. I've seen this firsthand, and barely a week goes by when I don't visit a local school. I've seen children at 5 years old still in nappies, unable to communicate properly, arriving not knowing what a book is or how to hold one, unable to settle in primary school. The government introduced free childcare starting at 2 years old, aimed at supporting these children sooner, but inevitably it seems often those most in need are the ones who don't take it up. But children who have a good start in life tend to do better at school, attend lessons regularly, form meaningful friendships, are significantly less likely to offend or experience mental health problems later in life. Nurture care within schools ensures that children engage with more supportive experiences, giving them necessary social and emotional skills to succeed and develop resilience. But Mansfield has some great examples. I will give way.
He's making an incredible speech, and I'm very proud to serve with him on the Education Select Committee. Just on the point he's raising about the importance of nurture groups, would my honourable friend agree with me that one of the ways that this could be carried out by schools right across the constituency would be if this was somehow acknowledged in Ofsted reports, the fact that schools are making this extra effort to be inclusive and offer nurture groups in schools?
I thank you for your intervention and for the kind comments. I absolutely agree that it's positive to see the changes in recent Ofsted's proposals to look more at the holistic support within schools and not just academic results, but we could certainly go further with that. And this kind of provision could be included in that. Mansfield has some great examples of schools that work to provide nurture care for their pupils. One I'd like to mention in particular is Forest Town Primary School, which supports its most vulnerable pupils through a nurture group. It's almost a school within a school, providing a holistic care to help children engage with education early on. I will give way.
Thank the Honourable Gentleman for giving way. Last year I was in a number of schools in Coventry, and some of those schools in particular, there were short of resources to employ what you would call specialist teachers for kids that have got special needs. And we find the same thing in terms of nursery provision in some of the most deprived areas in Coventry. Would you not agree with me, and I don't want to be too political, that this is something the government's got to try and address somewhere down the line here?
I thank you for that, and I agree. I think there's certainly a case to be made for specialist training and changes to the way that we do train teachers, which is something I know that government has touched on, certainly in discussions I've had with ministers in the department. I visited the centre at Forest Town, which is a separate building on the school site where young people who are finding mainstream education challenging in those early years can have a quieter, more personal, supportive environment and slowly build up to that full school experience. Some have special educational needs, some challenging situations at home. All are able to grow at their own pace with that extra support. It's a bit like an alternative provision, but it's on site and is therefore more flexible. It allows the children to move in and out of that mainstream setting, to have a space to call their own within school, but equally not to be excluded from those social networks in the same way as if they were sent to an off-site provision. The teachers at Forest Town I'll come back to that. Teachers at Forest Town do a fantastic job, and their hard work and supportive care for those children makes a huge difference to their lives. I will give way to the Honourable Lady.
I thank you again for giving way. And just on the point about, you were talking about the different curriculum that's offered to these children in nurture care, which is more bespoke and suitable for them. Would the Honourable Gentleman agree with me that therefore they shouldn't be subject to the same accountability measures in judging their progress as some of their peers, because they are getting a bespoke and individualised experience?
I thank you for that, and I agree. I think there has to be some leeway. We talk in this place often about aspiration and people's aspirations for the future. For some people, that is A-levels and university. For other people, it's just being able to live a relatively normal life and to get on in school, to be able to get into employment and much simpler things, actually. And there should be an acceptance of that, I think, within the way we judge schools more broadly. I will give way.
I thank my friend for giving way and for his work on the Select Committee, and note that there's a number of Education Select Committee members who come here today. With the point that he's making about this organisation on site within the school, he will know from our report on alternative provision that what we suggested was that it's very important that if it's learning support units or other organisations within the school, that the teachers should be properly trained in order to deal with those children who have difficulties, when at the moment what often happens is they may be supply teachers or they may be temporary teachers who don't necessarily have those skills. And actually that could make a world of difference, because as he's describing how much better it is for the child to stay within the main school, move within the mainstream unit and the separate unit, depending on his or her difficulties.
I thank you for that intervention, particularly thank himself and those members of the Select Committee that have come along today. I absolutely agree that, I'll touch on it later in my speech, that it's important that this isn't exclusion from the classroom. This is a nurturing and supporting environment to help these children to succeed. I'll give way.
First of all, Sir Christopher, can I congratulate the Honourable Gentleman for Mansfield and bringing it forward, and I think the fact that we've all made interventions is an indication of our interest. Alongside him, I believe there's a real need for the short-term focused intervention for children with particular social, emotional and behavioural difficulties that is found in the nurture groups. Does the Honourable Gentleman not agree that there's a need to increase the availability of nurture groups, which will allow individual children to reach potential, but also ensure that teachers are able to better spread their time and energy through classes where children who are unable to learn in a typical classroom setup can do so by being taught in a dedicated way that benefits everyone?
Thank you for that, and I'll touch on some statistics from Northern Ireland a little bit later that I hope you'll find interesting. But I agree. I think the way and the reason that the provision at Forest Town works in particular is that it is, whilst it's a separate building and a separate environment, actually it is included within the school, and it allows the teachers to engage with it and children to dip in and out and to have that integrated and supported approach that he describes. I think it's an incredibly beneficial thing. The earlier we can get children and families engaged with nurture care, the better. Children learn best when they have strong self-esteem, a sense of belonging and resilience. Nurture groups were first developed in London, actually, in 1969 by an educational psychologist, Marjorie Boxall. And large numbers of young children were entering primary school in inner London with severe emotional and behavioural difficulties, which led to a high demand on special school places in particular. Marjorie Boxall understood that these children hadn't received the early support and weren't ready to meet the needs and demands of primary schools, and as a response, nurture care was developed and has consistently been proven to be an effective way of helping disadvantaged children. They tend to offer short-term, inclusive and focused intervention. The groups are classes between 6 and 12, supported by the whole school, not just a specialist staff for that particular site, but by teachers across the school, by parents as well, who are often included in the provision. And each group is run by a couple of members of staff who assess learning, communication and emotional needs and try effectively to break down those barriers to learning in that mainstream environment. Crucially, the children who attend remain an active part of their class and their school as well. They're not excluded, they're not taken off-site into alternative provision. They are able to engage in the classroom with their peers wherever that is possible and wherever they are comfortable. I'll touch on this again later during my remarks on alternative provision, but I strongly support programmes that allow children to remain in mainstream schooling, to engage with their peers. I think it's better for the child and better for the taxpayer wherever that is possible. The relationship between staff and pupils in nurture groups provides a consistent and supportive example that children can base their own behaviour on. For so many children, the importance of role models, quite simply, is vital. And this caring approach can be hugely successful. It engages children with education, gives them a positive and enjoyable learning experience, and it can help where they don't get that same support at home. Nurture groups have been working successfully for more than 40 years right across the UK and is supported by a number of studies. I was pleased to meet with Nurture UK last year in my constituency, which is the national charity supporting the whole school interventions like this. And their figures show that this works. One school in Kent running a Nurture programme saw exclusions drop by 84%, which I'm sure you'll agree is a remarkable figure. A 2016 Queen's University Belfast study also supports their effectiveness. They evaluated the impacts of 30 such groups in Northern Ireland and found them to be cost-effective, but also, while 77% of children who entered nurture groups exhibited difficult behaviour, this reduced to just 20% at the end of the programme. I'll give way.
Well, gentleman, for giving way again. I wonder if he shares a similar concern to me, because these nurture groups sound absolutely fantastic and definitely suitable for the children. I wonder if you would find nurture groups like this and this attitude towards looking at the causes of the behaviour in schools that have zero tolerance behaviour policies.
I think of that. I think it's an interesting debate, perhaps not for now, but certainly an interesting discussion. There has to be that balance, absolutely. And I'm a firm believer, having been to a variety of different schools with different atmospheres in discipline and in teaching children the value of that, but equally, respecting the needs and particularly of vulnerable children in cases like this. I don't think nurture care has to be this formal thing in that setting, but I do think there has to be that flexibility and that approach to give a more bespoke experience to children who need it. Absolutely. I'll give way.
He's very kind for giving way, and he's been most gracious to us all for the interventions. It's just he mentioned about the Queen's University, and I did a contribution in a speech last year and used those stats that the Honourable Gentleman has referred to. I'm just wondering, when it comes to summing up and integrating all the information from across the whole of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, there are many good examples, and that's one from Belfast. Maybe the Minister could perhaps take those examples of good practice on board.
I thank you, and I'm sure the Minister will do that. It's important to weigh up all of this evidence in terms of where we put our time and energy in education. I certainly think early in that primary school and early years environment it should be a key priority. But over the last 3 years, school exclusions have risen by more than 40%. If there was ever a time to invest in this early intervention and nurture care, I think the time is now. This early support, if properly managed, can set children up for their whole lives at school. Some will continue to need help, and it's especially important that those children who have needed that low-level ongoing support throughout their time at primary school don't then lose all of that when they go to secondary. That transition is vital. We can be more inclusive. We can support children to stay in school and reduce exclusions, but we have to both invest in it both financially and with the time and training for teachers. The links between school exclusion and social exclusion are well known. Children that are excluded from school are far more likely than their peers to have grown up in the care of the state or in poverty. They go on to have much higher rates of mental illness and are more likely to end up in prison. That cycle needs to be broken somewhere. These children are the most vulnerable in our society. They need greater support, and we need to do more to provide a supportive environment, ensure our education system provides positive, safe and reliable space for our most vulnerable children. Nurture care can turn around a child's life and help secure a stable future into adulthood. It's not a debate about financial efficiency, but I'd like to highlight an IPPR report from 2017 which argued that every cohort of permanently excluded pupils will go on to cost the state an extra £2.1 billion. The government should support nurture programmes because it's the right thing to do, but I'd also argue that spending on nurture care is one of the best value options for educational expenditure. It's proactive, preventative support. And just as we're looking at prevention in the NHS long-term plan, we should be looking at it in education too. I'll give way to Stephen.
Thank you again for giving way. You're making an absolutely excellent speech, which is quite surprising in education for me to find myself agreeing so wholeheartedly with somebody from the other side. But the point I'd like to make is that it's not just a financial consideration. It's also an accountability consideration as well. Even if schools had the money to provide the care that they needed for nurture care, and even as you're right, they had the money that would be used for exclusions to provide this early intervention and care, schools still might not want to do it unless the accountability system is changed to recognise this as good, worthwhile work.
I absolutely agree, and we mentioned briefly before about the changes in Ofsted's approach that I think are positive. I think we could do more to highlight some of this good practice nationally and to incentivise schools to do that. And I think, to be honest, we talk a lot in the committee about SEND provision. I think schools would love to have more independence over how they provide this kind of support. If that came with the right accountability and the right financial support to do it, I think teachers would embrace that. At this point, I'd like to mention the Select Committee's recent report on tackling disadvantage in the early years, which notes there's currently not enough of a clear and strategic direction in early years education. The report argues that the government has to remove barriers to progression for early years teachers to encourage recruitment and retention of a skilled early years workforce. We need experienced teachers able to provide effective nurture care and help with the transition from nursery to primary school. I welcome the recent announcements on recruitment and retention from government in schools, which has been welcomed by the schools I've visited since. I think similar incentives and support in early years could be equally helpful. The report also praises maintained nursery schools for ensuring excellent outcomes for disadvantaged children, argues we need to fully fund maintained nursery schools by the end of the financial year. Although this is a debate about primary education, the earlier we can start support programmes for vulnerable children, the more effective that intervention will be. As one of my constituents working in the nursery sector recently said to me, the early years of life are the most important of life, the building blocks for their future, and if you miss these bricks, it all comes tumbling down. I thought it was quite a poetic way of describing it. The report also discusses the importance of a strong home learning environment and the importance of reviewing the evidence around interventions which support parents and families in creating that positive home learning environment. It's important we continue to review best practice and share information about the forms of nurture care that are the most effective and that they engage with parents to help provide that. Returning to look more broadly at alternative provision, it's often seen as somewhere only the worst behaved pupils should go, but it's not. Alternative provision is much more than that, and done properly can provide excellent education. It's important to remember that it also covers education for pupils who can't attend mainstream education for a variety of reasons, health reasons, not only those who have been excluded from school. It includes things like pupil referral units, alternative provision, academies, free schools and other settings. And there are some excellent examples which provide tailored education to pupils who have struggled the most in mainstream education. The alternative school in Accrington, for example, offers a holistic and flexible full-time school experience designed to respond to the needs of young people who are unable to remain in mainstream. They cater for up to 90 pupils a year spread across 3 campuses in the northwest, and they specialise in a curriculum designed specifically for people aged 8 to 18 who require that smaller, more personalised and individual approach to their education. I think that's a positive path and an example to follow. So alternative provision, when done right, works well, but too often it's seen as a dumping ground for difficult children, a way to get them out of a school, and we need that narrative to change. As I noted earlier, I believe that where possible, schools should try to keep children in a mainstream setting. That correlation between exclusions and problems in future later life is significant. And I've raised concerns previously with the Secretary of State and the Select Committee about interventions like isolation, which I know the Honourable Lady feels strongly about. I'll come to in a second, which when done right can be helpful, but too many reports suggest they're taking children out of a classroom not to support them, but simply to keep them out of the way. I'll give way to
gentleman for giving way, and I was going to intervene just before you came to isolation rooms, just to mention one of the points in our report on this, our Select Committee report, which was about buddying up a mainstream school and alternative provision school so that teachers can share knowledge and expertise with each other. And I know there are some initiatives now going on where teachers are actually going to be able to teach in special schools for a while and alternatively, so that they have that shared knowledge. And on isolation rooms, you're absolutely right. There is a whole wealth of difference between a nurture and an isolation room where children are having no education whatsoever and instead are being made to sit there with a sheet to occupy them and not educate them. And then we wonder why at the end of that time period why the children haven't made any progress. But I will let you carry on with that.
I thank you for that, and I agree. I think partnership working between schools is something the government have promoted in a way, and certainly we see that work between schools in the independent sector and comprehensive schools in particular. But I'd welcome that, and I think teachers again would welcome that opportunity to get a broader experience and the training and development that comes with that. Providing proper help and support to children in an isolation environment, not isolating them but helping them, would be more effective in my view and cheaper in the long run than exclusion. And schools need investment in order to be able to do that. But I'd like to see alternative provision run more along the lines of a nurture care programme where possible. Obviously, I acknowledge separate settings can be the most appropriate option for some pupils, but I do believe where we can do more to include rather than exclude pupils that are struggling in mainstream education, that should be a good thing. And it stands to reason then I'd also like to see a focus on reintegration. Just as nurture groups tend to work on a short-term approach to alternative provision, not a final permanent destination for pupils, there should be a way of tailoring support with a view where possible to bringing that child into mainstream education, at least for part of the time further down the line. The figures show that over 77% of pupils in AP settings have special educational needs, so it's important we also look at SEND provision and how it can effectively help pupils at risk of dropping out of mainstream education. The government... I will give way.
He mentioned about children with special educational needs. Does he not agree with me that there is a significant problem when something like 4,000 children with special educational needs are excluded each school week? And often, unfortunately, then go to a postcode lottery of poor alternative provision, if at all.
I thank you for that, and I absolutely recognise that challenge. I think our existing inquiry on SEND and the Select Committee highlights the postcode lottery element and the confrontational experience that many parents face in terms of trying to get the support that they need. And whilst it seems that a lot of those involved have recognised the will of the legislation and the ideas behind the legislation to be the right ones, there's certainly a practical barrier in terms of delivery of a lot of that does cause those problems and doesn't always offer the support that it should. The government's vision for alternative provision outlined last spring was largely a positive one, with a commitment to ensure that it becomes an integral part of the education system with high quality outcomes for pupils. It's positive that government's increased funding for high needs and alternative provision in Nottinghamshire. The budget's risen from just shy of 60 million in 2017 to 64 million this year, which is welcome and will have a positive impact on pupils in my constituency, but there's still far more to do, and this SEND challenge is, in my view, probably the biggest problem we face in our education system, not a simple one to solve, but actually affecting mainstream schooling and budgets across the board as well.
Forgiven way, I did visit a school in my constituency, St Anne's, St Anne's Infants, which won the Marjorie Boxall Quality Mark Award for their nurture group back in 2016. So I appreciate the really good work it does. But I was in Westminster Hall yesterday for a debate on special educational needs, and there's real concerns around the country about the lack of funding for that. And I think we do need the point that the Honourable Member just said about integrating this into the education service. It shouldn't be these excellent groups that are getting excellent provision in some schools. We actually need to make sure that whether it's children with emotional needs or physical needs or just children that need a decent education get support in a joined up way.
Absolutely. I welcome some of the things that government have done in terms of recent pilots, in terms of mental health support in schools and some of the positive things that's happening there. But it does need to happen across the board. You're absolutely right. And to have that experience for every child who has that need to be able to access the support, not for it to be a postcode lottery as has been described. The quality of alternative provision is too variable across the country, and while some settings have brilliant teachers trying to turn around lives, others don't have that focus, and the most vulnerable pupils are often not getting the education that others are, both in SEND and behaviour management. One size doesn't fit all, so schools need to be able to find and offer the right intervention. I'll conclude, Christopher, and ask the Minister to look at the ways in which government can do more to support nurture provision in primary schools, with a view to offering early support, particularly in deprived areas that are most in need, helping more children to stay on in mainstream education, helping cut the number of exclusions, giving children in my constituency better life chances, and also saving the taxpayer money in the long term. But I'd like to see more of that supportive focus within alternative provision too, support for schools to have more in-school alternatives to exclusion or outside provision. And I believe that approach is one of the most effective ways to support vulnerable pupils.
The question is that this House has considered nurture and alternative provision in primary schools. Marianne Vellows.
Thank you, Sir Christopher. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and I congratulate the Honourable Member for Mansfield for securing this important debate. And it is very good to see so many fellow colleagues on the Education Committee in attendance. Nurture groups are recognised as the best way forward for children, especially those from a disadvantaged background. In Scotland, we have a system which we call GIRFEC, Getting It Right for Every Child, and it's the basis of how children are put at the centre of any educational initiative. As a member previously of the local education committee when I was a councillor, I can tell you that this GIRFEC policy is well thought of and well established and well used across Scotland. And Nurture UK have actually pointed out that there are more nurture groups in Scotland, especially in Glasgow, Angus and West Lothian, than in the rest of the UK, which is sending out the signal that education in Scotland is setting about things in the best way possible. Indeed, the First Minister has made the closing of the attainment gap in Scotland, that is the attainment gap between the children from poorest and richest households in Scotland, the cause célèbre, if you like, of this particular term of office for her. Sir Christopher, all children and young people deserve to get the support they need to reach their full learning potential, and there's long established evidence base for the use of nurture groups to do this. Children and young people should learn in the environment which best suits their needs, whether that is in mainstream or special school setting. 97% of children with additional support needs are educated in mainstream schools in Scotland, and the Additional Support for Learning Act places duties on education authorities to identify, provide for and review the additional support needs of their pupils. In my time on the Education Select Committee, and especially in this session, there has been, as my colleague, the member for Mansfield, has already said, there's been a lot of focus on SEND issues, and we're still taking in evidence. And it really is, I don't think there's any debate or difference across this chamber on the need to focus on giving all of our young children the best possible start in their educational life, even though they do come from a background that doesn't lead them to know what education should be like. I mean, it's not a new phenomenon. I remember talking to a teacher many years ago who could not believe that young children were coming into school unable to hold a book. Now, if that was 40 years ago, I'm sure that that experience is replicated across the UK and is even worse now. Children may well be able to use a tablet, but many of them don't understand the value of books. When nurture groups are being used, they really help to give children, and actually the teachers and the support for learning assistants in schools, a real insight into pupils and how they can best develop. And nurture groups help develop resilience in children. In fact, Nurture UK defines the outcomes from nurture groups as greater academic attainment, improved behaviour, because as we all know, if children are to learn, they need to be in the right state and be able to behave, to even just simply sit and listen. And a large mainstream classroom isn't necessarily the best place for that to happen. So nurture groups, which are typically much smaller and can be on site, which my honourable member, my friend and colleague on education, member for Mansfield, has said, it's really important that children, I think, feel part of the main school, and that helps them with improved behaviour as well. It also helps improve attendance and reduces exclusions, a very important point. The nurture groups also look to help provide a whole school ethos. It shouldn't just simply be about these children in a small group in one area of the school. And where nurture groups work well, the whole school ethos is affected and improved by that. And if the whole school ethos is right, and I can give a simple example. My granddaughter, who is educated in Perth, comes home to say things like, I can't do this yet, which is a huge improvement on what I used to hear from students who came into me in further education in West Lothian, who used to say, I can't do that, full stop. And when you start nurturing young children by saying simple things like that, it really does improve their life chances.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. And on the point of school ethos, is my honourable friend as concerned and deeply disturbed as I am with the comments that have been made recently in the press regarding flattening the grass policies, where the CEO of one particular academy trust was advocating going into assemblies to bully, humiliate until the child was in tears in a way of intimidating the rest of the children there into silence. Would my honourable friend agree that that is not the kind of ethos that we want to promote in our schools, one where you're bullied or shamed until you cry if you don't behave yourself?
I thank my honourable friend for her intervention, and I totally agree this is not the way that children should be helped to learn. Sir Christopher, I don't want to stray too far off the point, but I didn't know anything very much at all about the English education system until I joined the Education Committee in 2015. It was a steep learning curve, and I still struggle with the idea that schools are run not by local authorities, and different types of schools can be run differently, and that some schools are seen to be good by Ofsted because there are not many exclusions, because the fact that they get high academic results. And I think I agree with others who have said it is much better for everyone in the community and for society at large to have children who come out of school better people, more enriched, curious, and ready to learn in different ways than being simply able to pass a standard exam. And I think as well, from my own teaching experience in secondary schools, in further education colleges, I should say, there were many children damaged by a school system which didn't suit them. So I do believe that the Scottish ethos and the Scottish way of, and I'm not saying it's perfect because no education system ever can be, but putting children at the heart of the education system and committing to getting it right for every child is actually the best way forward. And I would like to hear the Minister's views on that.
Thank you, Sir Christopher. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. I'd like to thank the Honourable Member for Mansfield for securing this debate today and other members who've contributed. We would, on this side of the House, of course welcome any proposals which support children struggling with social, emotional or behavioural difficulties, especially when that approach is backed up by over 2 decades of research with over 60 academic studies showing its positive effects. At the heart of this nurture model is inclusion. There is now a wealth of evidence that inclusion works. In the early days of the coalition, the then Secretary of State for Education set the continued direction of travel, stating he wanted to remove the bias towards inclusion. And just yesterday, the Minister for Apprenticeship and Skills said that inclusion is not always the right answer for children and their families. Yet today, we have a debate brought forward from one of the Minister's colleagues on the virtues of an inclusive policy. Sir Christopher, I'm hoping today that the Minister can clear up the confusion and clarify for me the Government's policy on inclusion. Nurture groups delivered in school, supported by a teacher and teaching assistant, cost around £10,000 to £12,000 per student and in excess of £120,000 per year. It is hard to see how they can be sustained, let alone expanded, in the current climate where cuts to schools' budgets of £1.7 billion, coupled with a continually fallen rate in real terms of pupil premium monies since 2015. In fact, since 2011, at least 100 nurture groups have had to close due to lack of funding. And in a recent survey by the National Education Union, over 3/4 of teachers confirmed there were now fewer support assistants or teaching assistant posts. Of course, pleasure.
Thank my friend for giving way. In the last intervention, I was going to mention teaching assistants because they are so important. And giving a child that needs extra attention, that one-to-one support, whether it be SEND or emotional difficulties, that can often be the difference between them being able to stay in the class or needing to go to a nurture group. So it's really a false economy, slashing the funding for schools that means that they can't employ teaching assistants anymore. Does she agree?
I agree completely with my honourable friend, and almost 100% of teachers have also said in a recent survey that this level of staff cuts was having a negative effect on the support that they are able to give those pupils who need that extra help. Of course.
I mean, one of the things that I think maybe perhaps we'd all agree on is that the pupil premium has been very effective in providing that additional money and to give teachers the additional support. So does my honourable friend share my significant concern that in some multi-academy trusts, the trust is operating its own funding formula and giving a school less core funding because they're saying to that school, but you get lots of funding for your pupil premium, so you don't need as much core funding. So in actual fact, within each multi-academy trust, the bulk of the money is not going where it should to the schools with the high numbers of pupil premium, but instead being reallocated. Do you not agree that that's wrong?
It'll come as no surprise to my honourable friend that I do agree that's wrong, and there is a lot of mystery surrounding some of the pupil premium monies and exactly where that is going to. Maybe the Minister can shed some light on that when he sums up for us. Early intervention works. Ofsted in the past praised nurture groups as having highly significant and far-reaching positive impacts on young children and their families. These nurture groups have the potential to be part of a wider holistic framework that supports children with additional difficulties. But their value is not being met with investment or support from this government, who do not see the value of such early help. This is evidenced in the fact that local authority early intervention budgets have been slashed by over £740 million in the last 5 years. 1,200 Sure Start centres have gone, and budgets for children's centres across England have decreased by 42% in the last 5 years. For these nurture groups to have success, there needs to be an acknowledgement that, and I know this from my previous career, whatever work is being completed in the school environment needs to be supported at home, and that often the children who would need the support of a nurture group are the ones who are also having difficult time at home. Historically, these children would receive help at home to support the help they are receiving in school from statutory children's services in the shape of child in need plans. However, savage local government cuts under the misguided mantra of austerity have led to such services being beyond breaking point, with more than 400,000 children now classed as in need, a further 1,700 children being referred for extra help every single day, and a looming £3.1 billion funding gap in local authorities by 2025. Coupled with extensive year-long waiting lists for child and adolescent mental health services, it is easy to see why so many children are slipping through the net. The Education Select Committee's recent report, Forgotten Children, criticised the government for their strong focus on school standards that has led to school environments and practices that have resulted in disadvantaged children being disproportionately excluded, putting pressure on an already struggling alternative provider sector, where the number of children with SEND has increased by more than 50% in recent years, and those pupils claiming free school meals remain overrepresented in exclusion figures, over 140,000 facing fixed period exclusions during 2016 and 2017. Nurture groups and other initiatives can prevent exclusions. One primary school, as already stated, has said that their nurture group reduced their exclusion rate by 84%. With all of this in mind, can the Minister let us know when the delayed findings from the Timpson review are going to be revealed? Sir Christopher, it really is time the government looked more holistically at children's needs, at early intervention and models that actually work. Last year, more than 120 national organisations wrote to the Prime Minister stating unequivocally that this government are ignoring children right across the board. I hope that the Minister can offer some assurances in his response that they won't have to repeat the same exercise next year.
Minister.
Thank you very much, Sir Christopher, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship again, I think. And can I congratulate my honourable friend, the member for Mansfield, on not only securing this debate, but opening it so effectively and with such an interesting opening speech. All schools, Sir Christopher, including primary schools, should be well-behaved and safe environments where pupils are respectful to one another and able to fulfil their potential. An effective whole school culture should set high expectations and standards for all pupils whilst providing support for the most vulnerable children, including those with mental health issues, and providing care, and those with special educational needs and disabilities. As the Secretary of State set out in his speech to the Resolution Foundation last July, one of the department's top priorities is to create a system which helps the most disadvantaged children to reach their full potential. So the question is, how do we ensure that we give children the best start in life? And I acknowledge my honourable friend's argument that too many children still fall behind with their communication and language skills early. And we know that it's hard to close the gaps that emerge. 28% of children finish their reception year still without the early communication, language and literacy skills that they need to succeed. So the Secretary of State has set out his ambition to halve that figure by 2028. And to support this, we're investing over £100 million in our social mobility programme. And this includes £20 million in high-quality, evidence-based training and professional development for pre-reception early years staff in disadvantaged areas, £26 million in a network of English hubs to promote effective early language and effective reading, and £10 million to understand what works. And that will be in partnership with the Education Endowment Foundation. Happy to wait, Honourable.
I thank the Minister for giving way. Unfortunately, he has failed to address the other point that the Honourable Member made, which was about children with social and emotional problems. You've mentioned briefly children with special educational needs, and you've mentioned children who are starting from a delayed academic standpoint. But what support does this government want to give, or is it using initiatives or pilots or anything for children with social and emotional problems?
Yes, well, I will come to that in a moment. The Honourable Lady will be a little patient. I will come to the issue, certainly the issue of mental health as well in particular. Now, what happens in the early year settings is only, of course, part of the story. What happens in the home is central to children's outcomes, and we think we can do more to ensure that all parents have access to the best advice, tools and resources to support their children in the earliest years. And that's why we are inviting a broad range of organisations to come together as part of a coalition to explore innovative ways to boost early language development and reading in the home. And following the successful Home Learning Environment Summit in November, we are developing a campaign that will be launched later this year. It is clear, Sir Christopher, that early education from age 2 has long-lasting benefits for children, as my honourable friend intimated in his speech. And it helps to promote a child's physical, emotional, cognitive and social development. But as my honourable friend suggested, evidence shows that, on average, disadvantaged families are less likely to make use of formal childcare provision than more advantaged families. So that's why in September 2013, the government introduced 15 hours of funded early education for the most disadvantaged 2-year-olds. And eligibility was expanded in September 2014 to include children from low-income working families, children with a disability or special educational need, and children who have left care. And this early education for 2-year-olds programme is popular with parents. In January 2018, local authorities reported that 72% of eligible parents nationally took up their entitlement to a place, up by 1% from January 2017. And take-up of the free entitlement for 2-year-olds in Nottinghamshire is in line with the national average. But there is still more work to do, and that's why we have commissioned our national delivery contractor, Childcare Works, to support local authorities to increase take-up of the 2-year-olds offer amongst disadvantaged parents in particular. And we've also commissioned Quorum and Family Care Childcare Trust to support the take-up of the free entitlements through their Parent Champions programme. Of course, nursery schools also have an important part to play in ensuring excellent outcomes for disadvantaged children. There is, I realise, uncertainty over the future of funding for maintained nursery schools. The current arrangements that protect maintained nursery schools funding provide nearly £60 million of additional funding a year, but that's due to end in March 2020, which is, of course, the end of the spending review period. This supplementary funding was a temporary arrangement to ensure that maintained schools didn't miss out when we introduced the early years national funding formula, and we need to decide what should happen once that supplementary funding ends. And as preparation for the forthcoming spending review, we are considering how best to handle transitional arrangements for a number of areas, including maintained nursery schools. Now, my old friend talked about supporting children with special educational needs. The SEND reforms introduced by the Children and Families Act, which came into effect in September 2014, introduced a new approach to supporting children and young people with special educational needs and disabilities from birth to age 25 across education, health and social care. And our vision for children with SEN and disabilities is the same as that for all children and young people, that they achieve well in their early years at school and in college, that they find employment, that they lead happy and fulfilled lives, and that they experience choice and control of their lives. Now, the reforms represented the biggest change to the SEN and disability provision in a generation, and they are intended to improve the support available to children and young people with SEN and disabilities by more effectively joining up services for 0 to 25-year-olds across education, health and social care, and by focusing on positive outcomes for education, employment, housing, health and community participation. I give way to Honourable Lady.
Thank the Minister for giving way. On the point of SEND reforms, I was wondering if the Minister could shed some light on why children with SEND remain stubbornly overrepresented in exclusion figures and are 6 times more likely than their peers to be excluded. The system just isn't working.
Well, this is precisely why we did ask Ed Timpson to look at why certain groups in society are more likely to be excluded than others, and he will be publishing his report soon. Of course, it's my humble friend, yes.
I thank him for his comments so far and pointing out, I think I mentioned in my speech the positive intentions of the 2014 Act, and that has been broadly well received in the evidence in the committee as well, in terms of the reasons and the aspiration of it, absolutely. Would he recognise, talking about working together across different sectors and bringing those services together, the element that has often been raised as the problem in that the challenge local authorities face in terms of getting health to genuinely engage and to fulfil their commitments within EHC plans and within that Act? How can we work to get those health bodies involved more actively engaged in supporting children within SEND provision?
Yes, my honourable friend raises an important point, and these are the challenges that local authorities face, and we are continually working with local authorities to improve the quality of the provision in those local authorities. In terms of the SEN budget, which I think I will come on to, we are concerned about the high needs budget of schools. That's why the Secretary of State recently announced an extra £250 million of funding. That's £125 million in this financial year and £125 million in the next financial year to help local authorities with their high needs budget, and I think that's been welcomed by local authorities. I'll give way to the Honourable Lady.
I thank the Minister for giving way, and I agree with my honourable friends here that the Act did raise aspirations. But there was a few issues with it. One, it raised it until the age of 25, without any additional funding between 18 and 25 to provide for that aspiration. But it also raised a huge aspiration in terms of what parents are now entitled to, but without the ability to actually provide that, which is why we now have parents taking local authorities to court, why we have a huge bulging costs in tribunal fees and in lawyer fees, and it fears that when we see the tip of the iceberg, which is the parents with their social capital and the knowledge to be able to fight this, we know that there are thousands of parents underneath who are just not getting their children's needs met. So I would say to the Minister, this is more than just a small issue. This is a huge fundamental rethink needed in SEND.
These issues, of course, are not new. They exist. They've existed for as long as I've been taken a specialist interest in education. They were certainly very key issues during the last Labour government, and that's one of the reasons why we introduced the 2014 Act, to try and address those very issues, the disputes that were taking place in tribunals, and that's why we introduced the 2014 Act, to try and address those very issues, to ensure there was much more coordination between the different services. And we've increased funding for high needs education from £5 billion in 2013 to £6 billion by this year, and then in addition to that another £250 million, bringing it up to £6.3 billion by next year, because we absolutely do understand the pressure under the high needs budget. And one of those pressures, the Honourable Lady, the member for Hull West and Hessel, is absolutely right, that one of the reasons for those pressures is, of course, the extension of entitlement to the age of 25 for children with special educational needs and disabilities. But we don't apologise for that, because those young people do need that support.
Order. The Honourable Lady
has made many, many interventions. The Minister's trying to respond to her points. All she's doing is chuntering. No? Order.
Order. Minister.
No, I understand the Honourable Lady's passion about these issues, but she should not underestimate the passion on this side of the debating chamber as well, and the action that we have taken since being in office to address these very difficult issues and to try to provide the funding for them as well. But we do understand that at the moment local authorities do feel under pressure on their special, the high needs budgets, and that's why there has been the extra payment of £250 million to try to deal with that. And we accept that it will not deal with the issue fully. We're trying to provide more capital for local authorities to enable them to restructure their special educational needs provision. So, for example, as well as the age extension, which has been a pressure on budgets for local authorities, there's also the issue of the costs of, for some children with very severe special educational needs, the cost of independent school provision can be very expensive, and it sometimes is more cost-effective for local authorities to provide special educational needs schools or units of maintained schools in their own borough. And that is why we have allocated significant capital to enable that to happen. Now, so Christopher, as my honourable friend says, much of the support work for pupils will, of course, take place within the school setting. And, for instance, when a school identifies a pupil who has special educational needs, they should take action to remove barriers that are in the way of that child's education and put effective special educational need provision in place. And the SEN support will often take the form of a cycle through which decisions and actions are revisited, refined and revised with a growing understanding of the pupil's needs and of what supports the pupil in making good progress. And this is known as a graduated approach. And one of the types of intervention that some schools choose in order to support pupils with social, emotional or behavioural needs, I said to the Honourable Lady that I would come to that issue, which my Honourable friend has talked about in detail, is the use of nurture groups. And as he says, nurture groups offer an in-school, short-term focused intervention strategy which is aimed at addressing barriers to education arising from behavioural, social or emotional difficulties, and to do so in a very supportive manner. And it is for individual schools, of course, to decide which interventions to offer and the best and most cost-effective potential in offering that support for an individual pupil's needs. Now, as my honourable friend has mentioned, I know that the Forest Town Primary School in his constituency is rated good by Ofsted. It is an example of a school which uses nurture groups to support its pupils. And in their inspection report in March 2017, Ofsted praised the school's positive culture and the determination that all its pupils succeed. And Ofsted also highlighted Forest Town's work to promote high levels of attendance and the school's timely adoption of interventions for different pupils and their support for vulnerable pupils with complex needs. And I would like to take this opportunity to pay tribute to the teachers at Forest Town and elsewhere for the important work that they do for those children. Now, all children, Sir Christopher, have the right to a school environment that is safe and conducive to effective teaching. Of course, sometimes that will mean head teachers taking the difficult decision to exclude a pupil, and I fully support head teachers using exclusion where this is warranted. But exclusion from school must not mean exclusion from education, and when a child is excluded, suitable full-time education must be arranged from the 6th school day of exclusion. And the Timpson Review of Exclusion is considering how schools use exclusion and how this impacts on all pupils, but in particular why some groups of children, such as those with special needs, are more likely to be excluded from school. Alternative provision is the system that is in place to educate those pupils who are unable to attend mainstream school, but it is vital that those pupils who do enter alternative provision following exclusion have access to a high-quality education to help every child achieve their potential. Local authorities or schools as commissioners must have regard to our statutory guidance, which states that good alternative provision is that which appropriately meets the needs of pupils that require its use and enables them to achieve good educational attainment on a par with their mainstream peers. Now, the guidance also sets out that the personal and social needs of pupils should be properly identified and met in order to help them to overcome any barriers to attainment. And that AP should aim to improve pupil motivation and self-confidence, attendance and engagement with education. There are some excellent examples, Sir Christopher, of AP settings that not only have high standards for behaviour, progress and attainment, but also have strong therapeutic interventions in place to support pupils of primary school age. The Hawkswood Primary Pupil Referral Unit, whose Ofsted report noted that pupils understand the need to manage their own behaviour and are able to reflect on the choices they make. This is because boundaries are consistently applied and expectations are very high. And one parent was moved to tell the inspectors that the school has made my son respectable. And another example is the Family School, which is an AP-free school which opened in September 2014. Their ethos is built around supporting pupils to cultivate a productive lifestyle, a personal resilience, and the values required to become responsible members of society. An innovative aspect of their programme is that it requires a parent or a significant adult family member to participate in the classroom with their child. The focus is on families helping themselves and each other to create the conditions and changes necessary so that children can resolve their problems and be better equipped to return to school, which I know is something my honourable friend, member for Mansfield, is concerned about. In both those schools that I've cited, a high proportion of pupils are successfully reintegrated into mainstream schools, and we are determined to make sure that every AP setting is as good as those good examples that we can cite, and for that best practice to be shared. And as I set out in our AP Vision document, which we published last March, we want to make sure that the right children are placed in the right AP, and that they receive a high-quality education, and that they achieve meaningful outcomes after leaving alternative provision. And this is supported by a £4 million innovation fund, which includes projects that have a focus on reintegration. So in closing, Sir Christopher, I want to assure my honourable friends and other honourable members who have participated in the debate that this government is determined to do all it can to support young people to achieve their potential, whether this be through continued support for early years services, supporting mental health services, reforms to the special educational needs system, and providing highly effective alternative provision where necessary.
In Bradley.
Thank you, Sir Christopher. I'm grateful to members who contributed to the debate today, particularly those on the Education Select Committee, who I think show a very clear passion for this subject and for supporting young people, particularly the member for Western Hessel with her usual passion for supporting the most vulnerable people in our society. I was pleased to hear the Minister's response in terms of making clear that supporting disadvantaged people and that commitment to social mobility is a key priority for government. It highlighted investment in lots of different areas, which is very welcome. I'd like to see that investment go into schools directly and to give them the ability to make independent decisions about personalised interventions for our children more often. I recognise the positive aspirations of the SND reforms that he talks about in the 2014 Act, and I look forward to the outcomes of the Timpson review. Can I thank him for his kind words about Forest Town Primary, which I'm sure will make them very happy. It is an excellent provision, and there are a number across my constituency. I hope that we can meet the Minister's expectations in terms of making so many of these positive alternative provision examples things that should be encouraged and matched and talked about across the rest of the country. I also recognise the work that he does behind the scenes in terms of making the case for education with the spending review coming, which is difficult in current climate and with the Treasury. So I hope he continues to do that. If I can help him in any way to do that, I certainly will. And to make the case for education being a huge priority for the rest of this Parliament, that will be very welcome. So I thank everyone for their contributions today, particularly, of course, the Minister for his time, and yourself, Sir Christopher. It has been a pleasure.